I teach across the street. I teach poetry primarily, but I'm also teaching writing and war right now. I have kind of a background in studying the poetry of war, poetry of witness. I moved out here in 2015 from New York, where I was finishing my PhD, and I was studying primarily mid-20th century German writing, and I wrote poetry in German for a long time. And, but I moved kind of all across the country because my husband's still active duty. And he's actually also our daycare system for today, which is really cool. He's over in the other room. So I've been studying this for quite some time, and I've been publishing poetry about the experience of war from the perspective of someone who's never been. And I offer free writing workshops at night one to veterans and one to spouses over on campus that are open to the public in the winter and spring, and I also teach on post here at JVLM as well. So I'm kind of here, there, and everywhere. I also wanted to mention to you that I'm the editor for Collateral. If you write works that concern the impact of war beyond the combat zone, that's what Collateral publishes. We're an online literary journal, and we publish poetry and prose and visual art that looks at that, the impact of war, so outside of the war story, beyond the combat zone. I want to get things started with our panelists because we have such a range of perspectives that I really want to hear. I'm going to have all of the panelists introduce themselves and read just a very short poem or excerpt of their work so you can kind of get to know who they are and what they write. And then I have a couple of questions that we can begin the discussion with before we open this up to questions from the audience. And we should probably wrap up around like 10:15 or so. Sound good? Great. All right. Why don't we start down here with Gary and we can just move our way down.
Oh, okay. Can you guys hear me good? I need to step closer or something like that? Okay. Get this mic thing right. I'm a veteran of the U.S. Navy Submarine Force. I'm a Cold War veteran. I was on a missile platform. Fleet ballistic missile submarine. And every time we left port, we were already targeting people. Our mission, if we ever had to go on a mission, was to respond to messages to take out key cities and key countries. We had 16 missiles. This is a total of 95 warheads, nuclear warheads, that you could program each one of them separately. And that was just my one submarine. We happened to have about 100 of those boats at that time, all operating independently. So every time we kind of step out, we are already into that hyper state, if you know what I mean. Did missions under the ice, did missions, all around, up and down the Atlantic. Not too much on the west. I had that experience. I had been writing before I joined the Navy. And I thought that joining the Navy would give me an opportunity to write more. And so, I was asked one time during an interview, what would you advise a young writer? Don't join the Navy. So that was that. I went to the William Joyner Center some years ago, about 97. That's where I met you. I first met you there. We were walking right behind him in his steps, almost and stuff, And that's when I also really got a focus towards poetry of witness, And the witnessing there extends to me, everything. If you're living in any type of extremes, if these are extremes on top of you. Right now, I feel like this country's in a war right now. So I think anybody that comes through has something to write. I think that this type of writing, dealing with what affects you, is really the universal thing. So I think supposed to read something as well? Yeah, I'm gonna read one from I'm reading from my first book, because that's where a lot of that stuff kind of jumped out at me. It was after that experience, that's after we were Jordan Center. That's what put me into grad school. I needed to get craft. I needed to get craft. So this is years after I was out of the military. A Russian submarine went down. You guys remember that Russian submarine? It was the RS Curse. That was the name, the RS Curse. We hated Russians, especially when they tried to track us and target us. And our thing was to slip behind them, because we could hear them coming and stuff. And we could evade. That was our advantage, was the sound of silence that we had. So we always played games, what we call games and stuff, And so this is, the name of this poem is So I Come Back and Find That Now She's Taking the TV. That black and white set on loan so long, it was mostly mine. A grateful receiver of all gifts, probably because I'm Southern and was living in 300 square feet of studio when she told me to take it. Because I had nothing else but window and wall. She knows. I like the small homicide of Friday night. But it's funny, when some people see you down once, they never can see you as anything but. I've had 4 broken noses, played street ball and fought in bars before both turned deadly. Nothing kills a dream faster than a pistol. Nothing unplugs you like a woman who feels you did her wrong. And that's regardless of the proof of the bourbon you submerge into the draft. A Russian submarine sits on the Arctic shelf tonight, within reach now only of God. The poor bastards have been sacrificed for the secrecy of ordnance and equipment. I shot expert with the .45, ready to repel all borders, kill any invaders, go ballistic, fuck the world from my submarine. Couldn't wait to play the games with the Russians, shaking Ivan before going out on patrol, loaded with cigarettes, a war chest of porn, a few Bibles, weightlifting gloves, and steel-toed boots. This was my bubblehead prayer prior to going to sea. Made a number of surfaces equal the dives. Made a number of surfaces equal the dives. Made a number of surfaces equal the dives. Big, black, American submarine. We didn't do TV. We didn't watch it unless we were home, maybe in the afterglow in some woman's arms. But tonight, nothing goes deeper to the man than living inside the machine. And I'm contemplating the loss of air, stuck beneath the thermals, in the damned thinness, in the cold lack of time. I knew everything about that boat that went down. I knew everything about it. And so that had this kind of impact on me, the fact that I knew what the news was releasing could not have been true at first. The Russians were saying we shot them, and I knew that boat was built to take a torpedo hit. I knew that boat had 2 nuclear reactors for powertrain. I knew that boat had a hull that just rejected all that. It was almost sonar-proof for us, And I knew the explosion had come from the inside, Because I knew what happened just from me. My first job was analyzing submarine stuff. I found out. And knowing that, then I knew how they had all died. And that's what led me to write that poem. Those facts came flooding in on me, that I knew the agony of it. And the thing I don't put in, sometimes it's what you choose to use and what you don't use. I didn't put how they died. too gruesome for me to have been down there. And I wasn't afraid of anything I had done on the submarine until then, and that was the years out of the submarine service. Probably talk too much. Okay, I'm gonna pass it on.
Thank you.
You're very good at talking. I could just listen to you talk. That's hard to follow up. My name is Simone Gorrindo, and I'm kind of the outlier on this panel in that I write creative nonfiction mostly. I did write poetry once upon a time, but then I figured out it was too hard. So I moved on to nonfiction, which has mostly been what I've been doing for the past decade or so. Though I also have a background in reporting, and I'm also an editor. I'm a book editor of memoirs, fiction, reported nonfiction, and I also run a literary magazine called Vella, which publishes and promotes writing by women. So I came to writing or about the experience of being part of military culture when my husband joined the Army, which was somewhat unexpected. We both came from very liberal families on the West Coast. I had no experience with military culture at all. So that was kind of an experience that I had to come to terms with. So I wrote about that for a while. And I'm just going, I could talk for a while right now, but I'll be brief. I'm just going to read an excerpt of a piece I'm currently working on, which feels kind of brazen, but it also feels apt in that it takes place in Tacoma. My husband is stationed with the Ranger Battalion at Fort Lewis, and we moved here about 9 months ago or so from Georgia. So this piece is about story hour at the Children's Library in the Proctor District. And it's kind of about returning to where I'm from and realizing that I'm now kind of a stranger in a strange land after time away in Georgia. And this is just a tiny little snippet of it. When my husband first joined the Army and our lives were transformed, I had tried to think of our stint in Georgia as an anthropological study, a view into another world. But that world, of course, became my world. Barbecues where men shot guns in the backyard, ceremonies where prayer was as integral as applause, nights where I was sick with grief as I waited by the phone, wondering if my husband was alive. I'm nowhere near the same person I was 5 years ago. In this moment, with Pilates guy yammering away about how Tacoma is poised to be the next Portland, I miss my Georgia friends. They loved Fiona when she arrived, and for all our differences, I loved them. Pilates guy's 13-month-old boy has developed a hitting problem as of late, he tells us. People say boys will be boys, he says, shaking his head. And I say, no, boys will be human beings. I imagine my Georgia mom friends trying to navigate this conversation. Would they feel like I felt standing in their kitchens in the beginning, sure that anything I said would sound like another language? It was a mystery to those moms when I had arrived at 28 with no children in tow. I sensed their confusion early on, their desire to ask me, what have you been doing? But despite my childlessness, they brought me into the fray, the de facto babysitter, the honorary mom at Mother's Day get-togethers. Everything I know about parenthood comes from them. You get through the days and nights by sheer force of will, by relying not on family or husbands, but on friends, and often just yourself. You are stronger than you know is a cliched axiom you reference more often than you like. You open your arms to people's help and recoil from their pity. And on the overwhelming days, you let your kids cry, walk into the summer heat of the backyard, and chug a beer. You lose it sometimes and tell them to shut the fuck up. You send them to their rooms for time out. You even wash out their mouths with soap on occasion. You also snuggle them into the late night hours and nurse them through every sickness and let them sleep in your bed because you're lonely too. You need those kids, their soft, breathing bodies curled against you as much as they need you. They are your anchors. Without them, you might drown or drift away. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Hello. Store across the room. Hello? Yeah. We get to share. I'm Phil Weigl. I was in the Vietnam War. I was a machinist mate. I was in the fleet for 2 cruises, and I did a year and a half in country on the river as a boat mechanic, which had a lot of other military duties that went along with it. And about 6 months in, you learn. It kind of dawns on you what's going on and why that war was such a failure. So it's strange. I came home and actually I had a PTSD thing, the night sweats, when I went back out to the fleet, and then we were there when the war ended, and we just sat there out at sea going in circles for a couple weeks, and then we went into a port and in the Philippines, and I had my night sweat there, and I didn't know what it was, and it was just soaked, all the bedding and myself, and I woke up, and it was really strange to have a night sweat. I didn't know what it was. I thought, oh, I must be sick. And then I didn't have another incident until I left the military in '76 and drove up the coast, and I started getting paranoia. So it's been a strange journey. I think in mid-'80s, somebody said the word, they were tracking, just before I heard PTSD, I heard hypervigilance was a veteran's thing, hypervigilance. I said, yeah, hypervigilance, that's pretty good. That kind of started explaining things, and then later the PTSD thing came. I turned myself in to the VA in '90. So many years after my experience, we finally got a solution, which is a non-solution. It just, you begin to share and you begin to unload. I was noticing last night you had, Bruce had some poetry about being in country, and I never wrote anything about in country until I wrote my letter to the VA, and that's the one that triggered me in 2011, around Christmas time, solstice of 2011. So I've been writing things, and one of the things that happened is you get woken up in the middle of the night with these words in your head, and you just get up finally after wrestling with them for a while, and then you start writing them down. And so this was the second poem I ever wrote. And it's called June 11 Diary. It's a Gemini Blue. It's kind of a resolution about things that went on emotionally and how it's connected with PTSD. For Catherine. 24 May 1996, awake at 4 a.m., FM radio plays me golden oldies. Awake before morning light, sliding between word and melody, trying hard not to find regret. I pull upon a thread of remembrance and find you. June 11th, 1967, Great Lakes. Irish birthday girl smiles, slow Indian boy falls, slow dance to Can't Take My Eyes Off of You, rock to Creedence Live, I drink old style tall, you're into gin and 7. A drunken sailor falls, spreads his ice across the floor, you ask me to help him to his feet, his dignity, you say. I balk, then do it anyway. Nom boy, you say, from the hospital. I pull him to his feet and we slide him out the side door before security can get him. Love and like struggle for 2 months and a week. On August 18th, you put me on the bus. June 11th, 1968, Long Beach, California. I call from the end of the pier to say, happy birthday. From the other end of this line, you say, sorry, you're going to marry soon. I hide my tears in Coors and sulk and listen to the Doors. June 11, 1969, San Diego, California. The war goes on over there. We're here preparing and tired of it. June 11, 1970, Sunset Strip. I flirt with a new dancer at the Melody Room. She smells of body makeup and lipstick and 7-Up. Her body swings, born to be wild. Wants to know if I want to go out next week. I am young and impressed with myself. I have switched to scotch and water tap back. I tell her I knew a Gemini once. In 2 days, my orders are cut. I can't say that I didn't want to go. There is something about this bravado thing. June 11th, 1971, Nabe, RBN. I have come to Cuddy and water cold duck back. My run to Saigon is showing results. I am slick. I have stopped thinking about you. I have stopped thinking about before. I don't dream of anyone. I am trapped in these strange moments, strange days. We are lost here. What are we? R&R starts on July 1st. I wait. June 11th, 1996. I pull upon a thread of regret and have found remembrance. It is you, it is me. We are trapped in those 2 months, a time I loved and regret. I can live with regret. I loved you anyway. I'll do a short one. Todd is here, and I wanted to do this taking care now. Tim O'Brien, for Tim O'Brien, I don't know if you ever read it or not. It has been 25 to 30 years or so since we neatly folded up those greens and blues, put away web belts, brass buckles, and medals of many colors. Nothing really, memories locked tight and safe. Yet there are these things that we carry with us to help us through hard times, treasures of sorts, useful things that serve a purpose, like before. There's this little 2-inch lockback, pretty little thing, good for slicing divots and cleaning under my nails. Not a buck or K-bar, but useful, still the same. Here's a mini Maglite, double or triple A, many fold-up scissors, Band-Aids for some cuts, a little silver matchbox and a compass just in case. A coffee cup of stainless steel, it won't break or rust. Shoes that will take me anywhere, soles were made to grip. These aren't exactly issues, but they do me just the same. They're right here when I need them, and they keep me through the day. Out front I wear these shades so no one can look inside and see the man born of loss and pain. Inside I wear a little darkness, the color of that wall, blacklist like a mirror, and full of the names of friends and relatives. My life is made of little things borrowed from a life ago, when things were tough and gritty, and I was young.
My name is Bruce Weigl. I grew up in a steel mill town in northeastern Ohio called Lorain, among what is now fondly called the working poor. I grew up in a family of veterans. My father had 5 brothers and they all served, including my father. I had an uncle who won the Silver Star in North Africa. My father joined the Navy when he was 17 and was on a battleship at most of the major battles in the Pacific. There was no fascination with war growing up, any more than there was among most of the other kids in my neighborhood. We played a game called War often, where we would throw apples or whatever we had available as ammunition. So there's a way in which, in this country, you're schooled in the art of war before you even know it. And if you don't think that's true, go into Toys R Us and check out the weapons section. When I was 18, I went to Vietnam without knowing anything about the Vietnamese people or their culture, much like my government at the time. It was a year in my life that changed me forever. And it took a long time to figure out what had happened and how I had changed and what it meant. But I was lucky I had found writing. And when I got out of the Army, I was fortunate enough to get into a really good liberal arts school, Oberlin College in northeastern Ohio. And they took me under their wing and encouraged my work. In 1986, I had the opportunity to go back to Vietnam as a guest this time. And I did go, and I've been back every year since then. I've studied Vietnamese, I translate Vietnamese poetry. I have an ongoing relationship with the literary community in Hanoi, so my connection to Vietnam is very different now than it was when I was an 18-year-old soldier. I have now spent more time in Vietnam than I did as a soldier, as a civilian doing work there. I was going to read a short poem. One of the benefits of going back is I have wonderful tour guides to take me to places that a lot of people don't get to see. One was Angkor Wat, and I was visiting a temple there with some friends, and I asked the monk a question, which I always do, and he was annoyed, so he told me to sweep the temple. It's called Sweeping in the Temple at Angkor Wat. The infidelity of granite blocks they laid 2,000 years ago is of particular interest to the locals, and nothing was enough to feed the machine in those days. Nothing meant nothing, and the wind said not a single word, even in the tree limbs' bare existence. The other side of the story would be different, of course. This is just something to let roll through you and then let go. Centuries have passed since I began here.
A lot of people have a cohesive story. They were an active veteran. I really admire them for that. My story's not really cohesive other than it runs the thread of my own life. So I've got 4 snapshots, and it's a lot like Harper Lee's Scout. I'm 7 years old, and my aunt and my cousins are suddenly living with us in 1972. And I point to my cousin, he's 12, and I said, "What's that on your thigh?" He said, "Oh, I got shot." "Oh, okay," then we keep playing. Well, here's how he got shot. In 1968, he was 4 years old, and they were on a mission trip to go to Manila, Philippines, and my uncle and one of my cousins was gunned down by the Viet Cong. So my life has always these bizarre scout-like echoes. I didn't know about that. Second person, my dad. Why can't Dad hear so much? And why is Dad screaming at me right now? He was in peacetime as a veteran, proudly served, but as a racially segregated army that he had never experienced before because he grew up in a small town. So the white doctor wouldn't treat him, so his eardrum burst and he had to go AWOL and then got in trouble when he got back. Another mentor who helped me start Cave Moon Press, that's kind of why I'm here, because of this press that he started. Active medic in the Vietnam War. And he spent his life in his world with Blue Begonia Press trying to kind of put some threads back together, and I really admired him. And the 4th character is another snapshot, and it's part of the machine of war, and it's my best friend from high school. He's a 2-star general in the Air Force, but every time I talk to him, it's like talking to the vice president of sales of Nordstrom's, because he's had nothing of trauma. He did a small tour in Desert Storm, but every time I talk to him, the machine has done very good for him and his family. So it's like a corporate perspective, and it's a fascinating perspective. So I come to war from that patchwork world where it has had major impact in the collateral way that Abby mentions, but it's always been in a backward setting, is that I get this snapshot and then the story comes out later. And so the poem I'm going to read is after listening hours and hours to a father that was frustrated trying to get services for his Iraqi and Afghanistan serving vets. It's called Hey Diddle, Left, 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 and it's for the Taba Union Sons. You earn the bronze, I don't know why I'm doing this, I can't see, excuse me. You earn the Bronze Star, left, 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 right, left, to block out the memories of body parts. Left, 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 right, left, tour after tour and a hey diddle diddle, tour after tour. Left, 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 right, left. Dad wanted to take you to dinner. Left, left, left. I can't, Dad. There's blood on my boots. Afghanistan and McCord Air Force Base. Right. You don't understand. I'm not your son. I'm not the same person. Left, left, right. 300 miles to the VA. Local clinics can't fill your meds. Hey diddle diddle, whiskey to wet your whistle. Left, still lost in the Afghan desert. Stumbling footsteps today in a hey diddle diddle, right.
Thank you all for those pieces, for your creativity. As an instructor, I think I'm always looking for every discussion that I go into. I want to leave knowing what I'm supposed to be doing afterward. Every lesson takes me outside of the classroom. And so one of the questions that I really wanted to ask all of you, so that I can add to my library that I don't have room for, is where did you first start, where did you first notice the writing of witness? I mean, I can tell you the first time that someone finally taught me to be conscious of my citizenship and to be accountable through poetry, I guess, for the violence waged on behalf of my country. And when I first started seeing that in poems. But who were you reading? What poets seemed to bring you into that, or artists brought you into that? And then also, who are you reading now? Who are you studying now? Who is inspiring your work now? And actually, why don't we just start down here, we'll work our way down this way again, and then we can open it up to the audience.
The poet that I studied the most was my mentor, Jim Bodine, who wrote a great deal. And he's the one got me into trying to help other people in general with poetry, and so that's what I study. But on a personal level, I study ancient Chinese poetry just for the linguistic elements, and so between those two. Because my thing is my big deal is when I was studying Jim Bodine, I was starting to see some of the collateral issues that was happening with my dad, because PTSD is something new, but in 1972 I was just a little kid, and so I wasn't understanding, and I had to find a way to write through and cut that feedback loop that was in my head. So that's me.
I forgot the question.
Where did you first start reading now?
Well, when I was in Vietnam, a good friend of mine in high school that I grew up playing sports with stole a book from the library and sent it to me in Vietnam. I have no idea why he did it. We really never talked about poetry or literature, but it was James Dickey's poems 1957 and 1967. And I opened it up one day at this base camp, and I found this poem called Firebombing, which is a poem about a World War II veteran who 30 years later is remembering a bombing mission, and for the first time is thinking about the people on the ground, what had happened to them. I could not enter those doors unfired, he says. So that opened up a little window in my brain. I also got, the second thing that happened was I got dysentery, and I got sent to the rear, and there was a Red Cross volunteer throwing books, paperback books at people, and I caught one and I started reading it, and I couldn't pronounce the names in the book, but I was caught up with the voice somehow, and I read it straight through, and it was actually the first book that I ever had read straight through in my life. And it was Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Not a bad first book. So that sort of opened up things a little bit more. You know, at 18, you don't understand what's happening around you when you're in a war, but I knew something was wrong. I knew that we shouldn't have been doing the things that we did. I was fortunate to learn Vietnamese and to befriend Vietnamese poets, because then I started reading about the war from their perspective. And that really helped my work more than anything else, I think, was hearing it from the other side. I've actually had the experience of meeting people. I was sharing this with someone this morning, meeting people that ambushed my unit from the other side. And we started comparing notes one day. And I remember that bridge, and oh yeah, Christmas Eve, yeah, that was me, he said. So I have a slightly different perspective, I think.
I never thought about writing. I just started doing it. I think that when I was at the University of Washington in the late 70s, I started reading Native writers, Joey Harjo and others like that. And I took a couple writing courses from Native writers, James Welch and a couple others. And I got a 4.0. That's pretty good. And it was, I was writing about how helicopters that were flying over the campus all the time triggered me. And at that time, I bought a pair of boots at the surplus store, and I was walking across Red Square, and it sounded, the boots had steel shank in them, just like the military boots did in Vietnam, and they kind of, and very, very hard plastic, and when they hit the brick, they sounded just like walking across these metal helicopter pads, and so I gave them away. So writing never really occurred to me. I did write back then and got a good grade, but I never thought about poetry until it hit me in the 90s. And by that time, when I started the Raven Chronicles, I was a journalist. I was writing articles. So I wasn't writing anything about my inner self. And the thing about having an inner self with PTSD is that eventually it explodes, and all this stuff comes out, and you have to deal with it. So I started dealing with it in the early 90s after my bout. We had what we called a 17-year click, which is 17 years after your experiences in war. You have a psychological click where your brain decides to let you know what happened. And because you spend a lot of time shutting it out, a lot of energy goes into shutting it out. I don't know how you feel about that. But it was, the reason I'm able to talk about it now is because I did a lot of work. And I, in '75, I went to rehab, naval rehab in San Diego, and began the process of talking about why I drank. And I quit in '75, so I have 42 years now. But that helped a lot, going to AA and beginning to process a dialogue. Even though I never wrote about it, I did talk about it a bit, but it never really spilled out until a few years ago. when I had to sit down and write that letter to the VA, and I wrote 5 pages of single space of things that I thought caused my PTSD. And I think the next week they stopped requiring that, I'm not sure. But I was probably one of the last guys that wrote anything like that. But they gave me 50%, so that's pretty good. PTSD, so. Yeah, so writing was never my intent. It's just pure pressure, internal pressure that forces you to put something down. Well, I have a book out, so I did write that back in '93. I wrote it in 1 month, and just in a big splurge. And I won a book award for the native writers down in Oklahoma, and never really went back into it again. And I didn't really touch on my experiences as much as I touched on the experiences of the men in my vets group and their stories. And it blended with mine. And it was based, the storyline was basically a mythical realism process, and it helped me deal with it.
When my husband joined the Army, I was 26, and I happened to be in journalism school, and I was very hungry for information about the military experience and the soldiers' experience, because I realized that I knew absolutely nothing about it. So I came at it from a pretty journalistic perspective. I read a book by David Phillips about some veterans in Colorado Springs who there had been a string of homicides, basically. And it turned out that essentially it had all been by this perpetrated, I guess you could say, by soldiers who had all been part of a platoon in Afghanistan. And so that book was really about the effects of PTSD, and it was one very extreme case. He won a Pulitzer for a piece he wrote in the newspaper when he broke the story, and it became a book. And that was kind of an extreme introduction to these wars, which, you know, I found now that I actually live in this world that journalism picks out the sexy and extreme stories. And I've become a lot more interested in the more complex and outwardly mundane, but to me more interesting and nuanced stories about military life. And then I became interested in women veterans, mostly because I was reporting at the time, and men didn't want to talk to me in the same way that women did. So I read Helen Benedict's The Lonely Soldier, which was about 5 different women veterans and experiences they had. And I reported quite a bit on women who ended up kind of incidentally in combat situations because of the nature of these battlefields, what they call the 360-degree battlefield. People end up kind of accidentally in combat roles. And a lot of them had been wounded or had PTSD but were denied benefits because they weren't infantry and couldn't be considered combat soldiers. So I reported quite a bit on that at the time. And then I also read fiction and memoir. I was trying to understand what the hell it was going to be like to be a military spouse. And I read one memoir called I Love a Man in Uniform by Lilley, which was interesting, but again, I later found that it didn't speak that much to my own personal experience, because it was by a woman who was married to a military intelligence officer. And the one thing I found is that most writing by military spouses, and there's more out there than you would think, though it's not as marketed as writing by veterans, is really by officer wives. And my husband's enlisted, and I think that distinction sounds kind of meaningless to people not in the military world, but it's huge. And I had no idea it was so huge. So a lot of that reading I did of memoirs in the beginning, I did not prepare me, not even a little bit. And then in addition, another book I remember reading was Siobhan Fallon's You Know When the Men Are Gone. Yeah, and that is a book that's really stuck with me and I've returned to. And she does a beautiful job of writing about both the experience of spouses at home and also active duty soldiers at war and soldiers who've come home from war. And I would say that fiction kind of helped me understand what this world would be like more than really anything else I read, which is interesting. I think sometimes the fiction I've read has the most emotional authority of anything, even though I thought that I was hungry for journalistic information in the beginning. My husband, for instance, he says Ben Fountain's book, Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk. I always mess up that title. He says that to him rings truest of anything he's ever read about these wars, and Ben Fountain has never been to war of any kind. So that's been kind of fascinating to discover that people can write about this experience without having lived it.
I think about witnessing, I think I've always have been involved in some type of witnessing. You know, as a person of color, we start writing, which we're speaking for the collective at first, it seems, you know. And like, I think the first person I really saw doing something that I kind of got hold of and wanted more in my work was Leroy Jones, you know. Back before he was Baraka, you know, that first volume of his, Preface to a 20-volume suicide note, that first collection, it grabbed me because what he's doing there is he's speaking about how the systemic racism and inequality affects the individual by speaking about himself. And so I started making this shift, and it's kind of odd because as he got older, you know, he started speaking for the collective, you know, a little more. But I made the shift then. And I think just working through stuff, I started reading everybody. I've always read Gene Toomer. I'll always have a copy of Gene Toomer, no matter how many of my friends steal it. You know, I will get me another copy. But I think really stepping into witnessing the whole idea and the whole how that works for me and what I can bring to it, it did start for me at the Weigl Charter Center. Was getting a step in that, and I read everybody that's there. You know, I read, you know, to see how people express these things. I believe you're going through things in this world. It seems odd to me now to be going through the same internal traumas of this country. You know, that I went through back when I discovered Leroy Jones. You know, but here we are. You know, so who would I read? Yusuf Kumanyaku. He's a constant of mine. You know, and I go back and forth. I read them books over and over. You know, I like the idea that I can pick one up and just let it fall to a page, and it's like a friend, you know, or something like that. You know, but I read everybody. You know, I read. That's what I like about Fauché and her Against Forgetting, that anthology. It opened up so much for me just to step into all those different time periods, you know, in the different situations. And so I use all those things to kind of like help me understand where I am, you know, or like what's going on around me.
You know, may I say something? Please. I wanted to put just a couple things on the table for our discussion. Remind us of a couple things. One is that in the Western tradition, war has been the subject of poetry for 3,500 years. Two, it's never made any difference. It's never stopped. So I'm a kind of a troublemaker. So I want to just throw that out.
Cut it out.
I think in the interest of time, we have have about 15 minutes left, and I wanted to be able to open this up to the audience. If anybody has any questions for the panelists, and any of the panelists, I think, be open to that as well. But the sound guy raised his hand first.
Hi. And it's not to offend anybody here, but I find all the panelists either had to join an army of some sort, or join on their own, and were doing whatever they did outside this country. And I don't know if the gentleman who served in Vietnam also had to get us insight of the other side, and I wonder how that influenced you in particular, and maybe all the others have read, natives' accounts from Afghanistan or whatever, and how that influenced your writing, if anything. Thank you.
Yes,
He couldn't quite hear the question, so I'm trying to rephrase. It seems that the question is, the rest of us have experienced war outside, and this gentleman here has had the most experience with the other side, or the quote-unquote enemy as we would see it. So what was his perspective from that?
Yeah, and how that influenced the other writers.
How that influences other writers.
Out of the country.
Yeah, well, primarily it influenced me as a writer because I began to read Vietnamese literature, Vietnamese poetry, which is a wonderful history of poetry, and it's a wonderful culture. Forgot what I was going to say.
I'm talking about outside.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. Yeah. It's so difficult to describe. When I go to Vietnam, and I go once a year, when I'm there, I don't think about the war. It's funny, my post-traumatic stress doesn't occur to me when I'm there. I don't have nightmares when I'm there. Loud sounds don't scare me when I'm there. It's a very odd thing. And I think a lot of it has to do with I have this enduring literary relationship now with these people that have spanned over 20 years. So I think I know a little bit more about the other side's perspective. And if you're a writer, that's always helpful. It's always helpful to know as many different points of view as possible, especially when you're writing about something like the human tragedy of war. There's not just one story. There's a lot of discussion going on now because of Ken Burns' film, and a lot of veterans don't like it. And a lot of Americans in the peace movement don't like it. But it's one version. And I remind my veteran friends that it's also television. Don't forget. And better than usual television, I guess. So I can't imagine anyone else having the experience that I had. It's such a unique experience. And I have a adopted daughter from Vietnam. Also, my wife and I adopted an orphan 20 years ago. When I first started going to Vietnam, they didn't know what to do with us. So one of the things they would do is take us to orphanages. And in Vietnam, if you're not married, you don't get government support for your children. So that's how these kids end up in orphanages. So, the first time I went to this orphanage, I wanted to just scoop up about 10 of these kids and take them home with me. They were so wonderful. I came back and talked to my wife about it, and she agreed. It was a really long process, but we were able to adopt my daughter, Hein. I wrote a memoir about her called The Circle of Hein. She's an amazing young woman. She gave us a beautiful grandchild, a beautiful half-Vietnamese grandchild. And it's another way that I've been brought closer to that culture by having this little girl in my life. When she came, she spoke no English, and I spoke very, very little Vietnamese. We had to travel together for 10 days. This was before the embargo was lifted, so we had to go to Thailand, and it was very complicated. But she was amazing the whole time. This little 8-year-old girl who, I showed up at her village, this giant man. I'm big to Americans. To Vietnamese, I'm gigantic. And she was so brave and so amazing. So I think, what would my life have been without that experience? How less rich it would have been without that experience. So the war's always been a paradox to me, because on one hand, it ruined my life. On the other hand, I know that I became a better person because of my experience.
It's interesting how you can't really talk about writing war without writing culture and without writing people.
Yeah.
It's really hard to isolate this. Sometimes I find the same thing in teaching, like this is a people issue. It's not just,
That's right.
it's not just war.
I think that, to answer the man's question, is that the war has always been with me. It's never left me. Everything I do is because of the war. I think I would probably be a totally different person. I don't know how that person would have turned out. But everything I do is in regard to the war. The reason I work in the communities the way I do is because of the war. Because that's where vets have to go. They have to go back to the community and create a stable environment. And an environment that's useful to them. So you're driven to do that. It just becomes a part of your psyche. And so you construct, everything you construct post-war is constructed because of the war. So I don't know how the other Phil Redigal would have turned out, but I know how this one has, and it turned me into an activist and a fearless person. I don't have fear anymore. I don't have to deal with fear. I don't get anxiety over getting up on a stage and having to speak. I just do it. And when I was active in Seattle, I didn't have that fear, and I began speaking to people very much unconfrontational, very straightforward, honest, and the lack of fear really helps. Because we always used to say, what are they going to do, send us to Vietnam?
I've got two questions, one for Gary. I heard someone say after September 11th, an African-American person said, now you know how we feel. This notion that you could be attacked at any time. And September 11th was way before the police executions of Michael Brown and everybody else. Is there some truth in that statement? That was one question I had, and then I'd love to hear Doug talk about the footsteps.
I think that may have been one person's opinion of it. I'm not so sure I can go along with that. And we're looking at the loss of thousands of lives in a flash, in a moment. It's not this long drawn out, decimation of people, But like, I'm also not willing to buy into that was before all the police brutality and murders. That's before the technology was so. I look at, as an activist, I look at the Black Panther Party. That started in 1966. And the full name of the Black Panther Party was self-defense. The direct cause of it was the murder of black men in the streets by police. So that's been going on now. I'm not bitter enough to say I want that to happen to somebody else. That I want to see people, as a writer, as an artist, I think we're really, we have a sense of empathy. And that lets us see people as, that lets us see humanity, the humanity in all. Not that we always have it with us in our pocket that we can light up like a cigarette, But, like I said, I hated Russian sailors, especially Russian submarine sailors, And like there's many times I've had a lock on them, But the empathy comes in when I didn't have so much understanding of what environment they're working in and what difficulties are there. See, because we did get to see all those guys. We get to see the whole crew. We get to see their pictures of them. you know? And they're like our crew. You know, these are guys 18, 19, 20 years old. An old guy was 30, you know? And so the letters that was found in somebody's pocket that described what happened to them, to read the histories of those sailors that were in the Russian news, they're just like our guys. It changed things for me to kind of make that shift, because when you're tracking them and targeting them, that's not the way you think. You know, there's no individual then, it's just a boat. You know, so to start to see something and feel something different, that made a deal. Now, as far as now you know how we feel because of being there, I don't think that even equates to how we can possibly feel, you know. But that was some bitterness, and that may have been that one person's opinion of it, you know. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, let's take one more question, and then I'm here for Doug.
One more question, then we.
Yeah, see if we can do this. Yes.
I had a question. Are you Miss Gorrindo?
Yes.
Is that correct, Miss Gorrindo?
Yes, perfect, yes.
Oh, thank you. I had to notice, because I had a long-term affection for the McCormick Branch or the Weigl Library, and I noticed you were talking about the story hour. It wasn't, I couldn't quite, in the busyness of listening to everybody's selections, I couldn't quite connect, you were mentioning the story hour to the part you read about how important the little children were to everyone. And I wish you could enlarge on that. Maybe it's your neighborhood, maybe you live there. But I wish you could enlarge on that, please.
Sure, yeah, I probably didn't do enough to introduce that excerpt. I was kind of trying to move quickly in the interest of time. But the Proctor District is not my neighborhood, but basically when I moved here, I had an infant, who I still have an infant, but she was 3 months old at the time. And I knew no one. And my husband is gone 60% of the time. So I went on Facebook and tried to make mom friends. And I wrote a piece about a blind mom date I had at the Proctor Library. And you know, I was excited because she's a clinical psychologist and, you know, educated and worldly. And I had spent the last 5 years in Georgia, where the friends I made hadn't gone to college. A lot of them had had kids when they were very young. I was childless that whole time until the very end. And we just had huge differences and real gaps in cultural vocabulary that when I first got there, I just felt like I had moved from New York City, where I'd been for the past 10 years. So when I first got to Columbus, Georgia, I felt like I didn't know how to talk to people. Like I just felt like an alien. And part of that is because my husband's enlisted, and had I been an officer wife, I think my experience would have been pretty different. And I just wasn't prepared for that. That and the Rangers are they're kind of like an extreme version of the Army. I don't know, it's sort of like hyper-conservative, and everyone's got lots of guns, and most people are from very rural places. So I had grown up in the Bay Area and lived in New York City, so it was just a radical culture shock, basically. So we moved here, and I was really excited to be here because it felt kind of like coming home, coming back to the Bay Area. And I feel like the story hour at the library in the Proctor District is some kind of like microcosm of the liberal section of Tacoma, you know, where everybody's talking about their grass-fed dairy deliveries and I don't know, and like one of the guys I met, Pilates guy, you know, he owns a massage / Pilates studio that he somehow runs from home, though I didn't ask him how that was possible. And he, you know, everybody splits the childcare with their husband, and everything's really egalitarian, and I've been alone with Fiona for months, and just like ready to pull my hair out. And so I guess I just found, you know, I thought that story hour experience and the blind mom date experience would be kind of, it's sort of what I've been waiting for, and we actually requested to come here in part because, you know, we wanted to meet people who listen to NPR, and we wanted good coffee again, and I felt really radically out of place at Story Hour. And I found that I really missed the Georgia moms, you know, more than I thought I would. And I also found that I'm just a different person now, for better or worse. And so that the piece is about that, essentially. And it's really, it looks at that through the lens of parenting, I guess I should say. And that's kind of been brought home to me. Having a child has brought that home to me more than ever, that I'm a different person. And that what I know of parenting intimately is just so radically different than the stuff that my friends from grad school or editing colleagues talk about when they talk about their concerns with parenting. So that's, now I find when I need to talk about parenting, you know, the concerns I have are the concerns that my friends in Georgia have, and they're not the same as my new friends or my old pre-Georgia friends. So, yeah.
Thanks. I'm blanking on the title right now of the piece that you had in the New York Times, the deployment.
Oh gosh.
But that was the first thing I read by you, and that would also, it kind of goes along in the same thread, even though it's not parenting, the voices.
Right. I don't even remember what that was called. I think something dumb, like deployment before Christmas. It was the New York Times headline.
Yeah, I can't remember.
It was not my title. I
If
can't
you
remember.
Google it, you can find it.
It'll come out. Yeah, that's an old piece.
Yeah.
That's very, yeah, that feels like another me almost, because it was written a while ago.
But very worth reading. And Doug, I wanted to hear a little bit about the steps.
Okay, Paul wrote this. He quoted Charles Potts in his foreword of his book. It says, "Avoid getting hit by falling pieces of the empire," and he goes on to explain. And what this was is a book dedicated for homeless veterans. The purpose of Cave Moon Press is to give back in community, and every couple of years we do some anthology on a cause, be it domestic violence, hunger. And so this one, thanks for Paul, is dedicated towards homeless veterans. The first event was last November, Veterans Day, which was a Saturday night. We had a big poetry launch, and that was great. But one of the nicest things, even having experienced this panel, is this is written in a community. It's got Kristen Iredale, who was a combat veteran, other combat veterans speaking of their experience, but also the collateral types of pieces like the poem I wrote, and fathers, mothers, sons, and everybody in community speaking about the idea. And the intent here was to focus on the veteran and not the macro reasons as to why those things happen, and hopefully give some kind of voice and help to homeless veterans that are wandering around everywhere. So it's that.
And you have copies of that also?
Yes, and I'm in the small press fair, and I have copies of this. One other book here. This is Krista Casey, pretty well-known poet out of the Pacific Northwest, and she writes. She was an active veteran who the machine kind of crushed her and spit her out, and life didn't go so well in trying to access the VA. So she's got some really powerful poems, and this was her last work that was published.
What's the title?
It's called Rules for Walking Out. And so there's another one. Thanks.
Thanks. I want to give a hand and a very sincere thank you for your perspectives today. It was really enlightening to listen to all of you, and I'm so glad that you were here. So if we could give our panelists